Today we're going to start with I think what is one of the more interesting topics in the world of VRay. So we flip back from Rhino into VRay, and so this is kind of the ongoing thing where we do some more Rhino, we do some more VRay, we do some more Rhino, we do some more VRay. So today we're going back to VRay, and a lot of you have figured out how to apply materials to objects, which is great. But you've also complained to me about the fact that the materials don't look realistic, or the bricks are too big, or those kinds of things, which is a known problem. And so I'm going to teach you today about how we solve that problem using a technique that's called texture mapping. And it has to do with how a particular texture is applied to an individual object. So I'm going to ask you to start today by creating several objects that we're then going to apply some textures to and learn how this texture mapping technique works. The first object, I'm going to use the box tool here to make a wall-like object. So we'll say maybe at 12 feet long by 1 foot by 8 feet, something like that. I'm looking for a wall-like object. And let's go ahead and change that to be shaded so that we can see it there. So I have a wall-like object. Let's do maybe another square. And we'll do it all about 4 feet by 4 feet. And we'll say this is maybe 4 feet high. Let's create maybe a cylinder. Let's say a diameter of 4 feet and a height of maybe 6 feet. Let's do maybe a ball, a sphere. Say maybe a diameter of 4 feet. I'm going to move this up. It's currently underneath the plane there, so I'm going to move it V for vertical by 2 feet, just so that it's up on the surface level there. And then, I don't know, let's do like a pyramid or something too. And let's do a number of sides at 4. And I don't know, it's about like that, something like that. Essentially, all I'm trying to do is create a variety of objects so that we can use those objects to kind of experiment with how textures are applied to the various objects. So for right now, I'm going to take all of these objects and make sure that they are on one layer, which by default is on the default layer. Let's go ahead and rename the default layer to be objects, for lack of a better term. Okay. So all of those are on an objects layer. Now I want to set up a few environmental settings so that we start to have some lighting and an infinite plane, so ground. So I'm going to take layer 5 down here at the bottom, and I'm going to double click it. I'm going to rename it environment. Right? And so the idea behind creating an environment layer is that everything relating to the environment can go on this layer. So with environment selected here, I'm going to create a sublayer object. So you see how I have an icon with 2 files on it? If I click on that, you see it creates a sublayer. And I'll call this first one lighting. And then I'll click back on that environment layer. I'll create a new sublayer, and I'll call this one, generally I call it IP for infinite plane. But for you guys, since you're not used to that, I'll just go ahead and write infinite plane. Okay. I'll make infinite plane active down here at the bottom. Oh, come on. There we go. It's active. And when it's active, I'll use the VRay toolbar, the one with the yellow surface with arrows going in both directions, to create that VRay infinite plane. Okay, that's on the infinite plane. Then I will move my active layer to the lighting layer, and I'm going to create a basic directional light. So remember, it's always easiest to have a box to work from, and then the directional light is the one that's hidden on the end. And we'll go from there to there, and we can get rid of this. So I have a little bit of light there that can then be there. This light is now on the light layer. So the advantage here of creating the master environment layer with the sublayer for lighting and infinite plane is I can choose to lock the environment. Oops, sorry, it's the current layer. Let me go back to the objects layer. I can choose to lock the environment. So I can't select the light anymore. I can't select the infinite plane. right? So by having those on a layer, I can leave them on, but just lock them so that they go away. And so I've done that. Okay. Furthermore, I really don't need layers 1 through 4, so I'm going to hold down Shift, and I will get rid of layers 1 to 4. So I just now have the objects layer and then the environment layer. Okay. So let me do a couple more settings in the world of VRay, and this is something that we've done previously in VRay as well. I'm going to go ahead and open up the VRay options. So I'll click on the little O tag in the VRay toolbar, or I can go up to the VRay menu and select options. Either way, we'll get you there. And I'm going to look at the environment tab. And this is the kind of the background. Right now the background is black. It's a little too harsh, so I'm going to just change it to gray. So the sky is essentially gray now. Okay? I could do it as white, but it tends to make the light just a little bit too harsh. So we're going to leave it as gray. Okay? The other thing that I'll do is I'll come to the output drawer here, and I want to click on the Get View Aspect button, which makes the rendering match what I'm seeing on my screen. Okay? So once those two are set, we'll go ahead and close the VRay options, and I'll do a first render just so that we can see that I can't see anything. How nice, right? And that's because I haven't applied any materials just yet. So let's go into the VRay Material Editor. So I'm going to click on the M, or go up to VRay Material Editor, either one. And that brings up this VRay Material Editor. By the way, this tends to show up in this upper corner. Okay? Go ahead and drag it so that it's more in the middle of your scene. If VRay crashes, you will still have access to your Rhino file to save and all the rest of it. If VRay crashes and it's up here, sometimes it's hard to get your Rhino file out from under the VRay. So just take this and move it into the center there and let it float. Okay, so now I'm going to start by loading up a material that has kind of a very obvious pattern to it. And you're free to use whatever material you want for this exercise, but it needs to be something obvious like brick or wood paneling or something like that, because then you'll really see what's happening. So let me go ahead and load the material. And I have it on my flash drive. Hopefully you've already downloaded the materials on your flash drive. If you haven't, you'll obviously need to download one. Let me go into VRay Materials here. And I'm going to go ahead and do brick. And we'll do a new clean brick. There it is. We can see a preview of what that brick looks like. There you go. Because it has a strong linear pattern, it's a good one to work with. Right? In previous years, I've done a wood pattern, wood siding, board and bat. Any of that kind of stuff will work just fine. The point is that we want something with a strong pattern so you can see what it looks like on a particular object. So I'm going to go ahead and right-click on the brick layer here, and I'm going to apply material to layer so that it's on all of my objects. Okay? And so now the brick has been applied. So if I were to render this, we'd get a view of my objects. And they don't look terrible, but they don't quite look right either. So let's zoom in a little bit so you can see. These bricks look like they're stretched a bit. These ones aren't necessarily wrapping correctly. The triangle looks really weird because the bricks are going on a diagonal. So I need to figure out how to fix this. Okay? And we're going to fix it using something called texture mapping. All right? And so let's start with the wall in the background first. And I'm actually, just to make things clear, I'm going to take these first 4 objects and I'm going to type hide so that they go away and I just have the wall. Okay? The opposite of hide is show, and that will bring your objects back. Okay? It's just a temporary thing. So we'll hide and they go away. And now I have just that wall. So it would be really annoying for me to have to, every time I want to see an adjustment that I make to the texture, to have to click on the render and wait for it to render. I mean, obviously this is rendering fairly quickly, but if you had a really complicated house or something with lots of materials, it would be really slow every time to say, oh, let me see a render, let me see a render. So there is an option for us to see a live preview of what the render looks like. And so thus far, we've stuck with wireframe and shaded mode. Below that, you see there's something called rendered mode. Okay? If I click on rendered mode, we'll see a preview of what my rendered object looks like. Okay? Now, the rendered mode is not accurate to what the final rendering will be. It's an approximation. And it's really important that you learn that, because if you spend all your time getting the rendered mode perfect and then you do the rendering, it might be too bright or too dark, or the light might be different or whatever. So you can't always trust it. But it's pretty good for the purposes of texture mapping, which is what we're going to work on today. The other thing to point out is in rendered mode, things like lights, right, and infinite planes go away. So if we go back to shaded mode, see how I have that light over here in the corner? Okay? When I switch into rendered mode, that light goes away. Furthermore, lines go away. Even if I use my polyline tool and I said, oh, I want to draw a line right there, right there, right there, like that, enter, right? That line will ultimately go away because it's in rendered mode. So it's just important to be aware that that can happen. So you may find that, wait, I can't select something, my lines are going away or whatever. It's because it's in that rendered mode. Okay? Okay, so now if I look at this object carefully, and see the back is completely black in the rendered mode, so it's not really helping me there. But if I look at this, the bricks look way too stretched out and too long and too thin. They kind of look okay at the end, and the top looks a little funny. So we need to fix this. So first thing that I'll do is I'll select the object itself. So it's now selected. And then I'm going to go over to the Properties window, which up here in the corner you see like a little colored circle. If I click on that, we get the Object Properties, okay, which has to do with the object itself. You know, does it cast shadows, that sort of thing. Okay? We're not so worried about the object. We're not even worried about the material right now. The third over is kind of a partial cylinder with some checkerboard pattern on it, and that's called texture mapping. And that has to do with how a material is applied or mapped to an object. So if I click on texture mapping, we get the texture mapping little window, and I get a variety of presets and options. Okay? What we're going to concentrate on for the first half of the lecture is trying to just use presets to approximate what we're trying to create. So if, for example, I look at this object is roughly a box. Fair enough? Okay, it's not a square, but it's kind of rectangular in its shape. So that would be reasonable to try out the box mapping. So over here, if we move over, there's kind of a cube that says Apply Box Mapping. If I click on that, nothing happens. Okay? At that point, I have to look up at my command line up here at the top of the screen, and you see it's asking for first corner of base, or by default, the bounding box. Okay? The bounding box is just a box that completely contains the object. So generally speaking, bounding box is the fastest method to pick. So I'm going to go ahead and click on bounding box. Okay? It's going to ask me for the coordinate system. World is the default. We're going to stick with the default here. And do I want my object to be capped? Do I want it to have a top on it or not? In this case, yes, I do. The default is yes. Okay? And you see that just by doing that, the front starts to look a little better, right? But the side is starting to get really squished, as is the top. It's starting to get, the top is probably the worst, right? It's really, really squished there. Okay? So I need to make some adjustments. So I have the box mapping applied, but you see after it's been applied, I get this lower section of information down here. Okay? So we see that the type of map is a box, the projection is the closest point, and the texture space is single. Okay? All of that's fine. Okay? If we come down here, we have an X, Y, and a Z position of our texture. That's fine. But if we come down here further, when we get to X, Y, Z size, you see right now I have a size of 144 by 12 by 96. Okay? So it's stretching or compressing the texture to fit within that. If instead I went to X equals Y equals Z, and I click on it, right, it's going to equalize the three values. And you see that as I look at my object, number one, the bricks start to look reasonable, but we also see that the bricks wrap around the corner and are at the same scale and size as they are on the front, which starts to look pretty good. Likewise, they wrap around the top, and I can see the bricks continuing on the top. Okay? Does that kind of make sense so far? If the density of these doesn't feel right, you can come down here to the UVW Repeat value. And it's easiest if you check the button for lock, so you only have to type in the value once. And we could change from 1.0 to say 1.5. and you see the bricks get smaller, right? If I went from 1.5 to 2, the bricks get really small. If I went to, say, 0.5, the bricks are going to get larger. So it's dealing with how many times this pattern is repeating on my particular object. We'll leave it for right now at 1. Okay? UVW offset, offsets in the x, the y, or the z direction. So I could say offset by 1, and it would move my texture pattern over. Let's do it by more. Let's do it by 10. Let's do it by, I don't know, 50. Yeah, it's not really showing. It's rare that you will have to adjust the offset. It's if the pattern doesn't feel right. Okay? And I'll show you another way of doing it a little bit later on. Okay, so that was just a box mapping applied to this wall. Not too bad. Okay? Let me show some more objects. Right? And let's look at this object. So let me hide these. Right? Well, this is very much a box. Right? It's actually a cube. So applying the box mapping would make sense. So once again, let's click on Apply Box Mapping. We'll do a bounding box. We'll do World, and we'll cap it Yes. Okay? Looks pretty good. Looks nice and even. Let's go ahead and change the x equals y equals z. Good. And let's change the UVW repeat to maybe 0.5. Oh, wait. I didn't lock it, so I have to go through and type it on each one. All right, so that looks pretty good the way it is. Sometimes, however, see how this front edge, the bricks go over and keep wrapping, but on the side, the bricks go sideways and then they go this way, right? That's the nature of a box. You apply the texture mapping, and one way isn't going to match up because the bricks run in one pattern. But let's say that I wanted this wrap to occur on this edge rather than on this edge. Okay? I can take the object, and again, we have our texture mapping applied, and I can click this. It's kind of a texture map with a couple little lines on it and a dotted line. It's called Show Mapping. If I click on Show Mapping, I'll get yellow dotted lines around my object. Do you see those yellow dotted lines? Okay? And I can transform and adjust these lines using all of the tools that I would in Rhino. I can scale them, I can rotate them, any of those kinds of things. For me, this is the one place that I use something called the Gumball. And some of you may have explored it before. It works nicely for some people. It drives other people nuts. For the most part, it drives me nuts. But in the texture mapping space, I think the Gumball is fantastic. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it on. It's listed at the bottom here, called Gumball. And it gives us this little axis that helps us to quickly move and orient our particular object. Right? And so for some people, like I said, this is valuable. So I want to rotate my texture space, or my mapping. So I'm going to click on this blue arc. And as I do that, I can snap that blue arc so that it rotates. And essentially now this edge is the one that wraps instead of this edge. Right? I could do it at a 45 degree. Let me turn off ortho for a second. Right? And I could do it at any custom value that I wanted. So look at the top. See how the pattern's changing to be going at 45 on the top? Right? And it's moving around the outside. And we can kind of see a live preview. So I could align it the way that I want it to look, etc., using something like this. And it may or may not be, you might not want it as a diagonal. I just like to show you these as a strategy. We could also move the whole mapping to one side, which is going to change where something is applied or what the texture looks like on the side. So you get the idea. Okay? When you're done adjusting your mapping, you can click on the Hide Mapping button. It'll go away as if it were never there. So it's just a temporary thing. You can turn it on to make some adjustments to the mapping itself. So let me go ahead and show more objects. And this time we'll work with the cylinder. So I'm going to take all of these and I'm going to hide them. And we're going to work with just the cylinder here. And let me go ahead and turn off the Gumball. And I'll select the cylinder. Okay, now the box mapping could work, but it's not really an ideal match for the cylinder. So instead, we're going to use the cylindrical mapping, which is down here in the next row. So I'll go ahead and click on Apply Cylindrical Mapping. And when I do that, I get the same thing up here. Do I want it to be a bounding box, right? And then I also have a few other things. Do I want it to be a solid? Do I want the direction constraint to be vertical, etc.? We're going to go ahead and go with the default values, so I'll just go ahead and hit enter. The coordinate system should be world. Do I want it capped? Yes, I do. Right? And so now the texture is applied as a cylinder all the way around. Okay? So there it is. At this point, we can make some adjustments. I can start with the x equals y equals z to make those the same, which really didn't do much for me. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the values before. Right? Let me go ahead and adjust the repeat to maybe 2.0. That's starting to look better. Okay? But you see that the top really isn't doing that great. Okay? This is an example where sometimes you just need to retexture map the top. So let me explode this object. Right? And just by exploding it, I have different settings on the top than I did on the side. And you see it looks different. Now I could start to make adjustments for the top. Let's make the top at 1 instead. Like that. Different from the cylinder. Okay? The way cylinder mapping is applied, it's applied consistently all the way around the cylinder. If instead I took the cylinder object, and let me delete this mapping, and I applied a box map to it, I'm trying to think of whether this will show well enough what's happening. The box map creates corners in your object. It looks relatively similar, so I'm trying to think if I have a better material to show. Yeah, I don't. I'll have to do a different example later on that shows the difference of where that glitch would occur on the side. The brick tends to wrap it nicely anyway because of the way it joins together. I'll come up with a different material for it. So that was cylinder mapping on this particular piece. Let me go ahead and show them all. And let me move back over into the sphere. So let's get these and make them hidden. Oops, take these too. All right, so here's the sphere. It's not bad by default, but I could apply a spherical mapping to it. And when I do that, it's going to once again be a bounding box, world, and it looks essentially the same. Okay? But I'll do x equals y equals z. That's good. And I'm going to work with my mapping. So I click on the Show Mapping button. I'll turn on my Gumball, and I can now adjust, how the texture is applied over the sphere, what part of it I'm looking at, etc. Right? So I'm making those adjustments as I want. Okay? So it's applied nicely to the sphere like that. So let me go ahead and show. Now let's get to the pyramid. Okay, so we did all of the basic standard shapes. Oops. So now we're at the pyramid. Okay, well, on the surface, the pyramid is kind of similar to a box, so we could apply the box mapping to it. So let me go ahead and click on Apply Box Map. And we're going to do bounding box, and it's going to be world, and it's going to be capped. Okay, and if we look at it, the textures are okay, but see how they kind of get skewed as they get to the top? They're not quite right. Okay, well, let's try something else. And one of the things that's important when we try different mappings is once you've created a texture map, you have to delete it before you try a new one. So don't just go up and try a new one. So I'm going to click on the Delete Texture Map. And maybe this time let's try a cylinder map. Okay, so we'll say, okay, I do want this to be the bounding box, so I'll hit Enter. World is fine. Yes, I want it capped. Okay, well, that didn't really do it either. Okay, so far I'm kind of striking out at my options. I could do the spherical map, but that wouldn't quite look right either. So we're going to move into something that's a little bit more complicated. Okay, so we've done that. The planar and surface maps we're going to stay away from. Those are if you just had a single surface and you were applying a material to just the single surface. Though most of the time you can get away with doing a box map instead. So anyway, so we've kind of run out of options. the cube doesn't look right, the box mapping doesn't look right, the sphere doesn't look right, the cylindrical map doesn't look right. So what do? Okay? So at this point, we're going to do something called an unwrap. Okay? And an unwrap gives us a little bit more control over where certain things are. So I'll click on unwrap, and I look up here, and it says select seams. So this would be as if I was going to unfold this object. So when you guys were in 130, did you have to make those little shapes? You have to create those? You remember that a little bit? That's essentially what we're doing digitally here. So I'll say, okay, let's make this a seam, and then let's go ahead and cut around the bottom, maybe like that. Okay? So I'm saying that's my cut. We'll go ahead and hit enter. And it's created an unwrap for me, but I have to see it. So when I look over here, there's a UV editor button, and I'm going to draw a large square over on one side. And when I draw that square, we get the unrolled shape. You guys see that unrolled shape? Right? You remember back to 130, we can fold that together. All right? And unfortunately, because I have the infinite plane here, we can't really see the texture very well. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off the environment for right now so we can see. Okay? So now I have the shape, and I have the texture. Right? I have it unrolled on the texture. But it doesn't really show me anything because I can't see the texture. So I have a couple options. If I come over here into the UV editor dialog, and I click use texture, I can have a checkerboard pattern with numbered squares. And I could look over here at my object, and I could see, oh, well, there's square 45, 35, and I can kind of see how it's wrapping around my object, and there's the seam that I created. Okay? So I could manipulate this. For example, I could rotate it. Oops. And we can see that one edge now has 82, 83, and 84. And that would match up right there. There's 82, 83, and 84. So you kind of see how I'm manipulating the unfolded version, and it's showing up in this version. So that's fine. And seeing the squares is somewhat useful. But sometimes it's easier if we actually see the pattern. Right? So instead of using this texture, I'm going to click on this little drop down. I'm going to click on the plus icon. And I know this is more advanced, right? But I want to show you this process. Okay? I'm going to go ahead and pick my texture. So I'll go to bitmap texture, and then I'm going to go find in the VRay materials, in brick. I did red brick, new clean. There's the texture. And I'll go ahead and say OK. And I'll say OK. And there's the brick. So I can see the brick flattened and unrolled, and I can see how it's being applied to my object over here. Okay? So let's say that I wanted this brick, right, to run up this face, for example. Right? I can take my object, I can rotate it, like that, and then I can look over here and I can see that it's running up that particular face. So you guys kind of see how that works? Okay? It's a finer control over what you're trying to have happen. So if, for example, I wanted this side here to be horizontal, I could rotate this object until that side was horizontal, like that. Now, one of the things that's important to see how I went off the edge here, that's totally fine. This is just giving us a guide for our shape as a whole. I could take this object, I could scale it. Apparently I can't type. Much, much bigger, and the texture would get much, much smaller on the object. Likewise, I could scale the object to be really small, and the texture would get really big. Okay, so just because you go off the edge of this, it doesn't really matter. So I'm going to go ahead and say apply when I'm done, and now my texture mapping is applied. It didn't really turn out much better, but the point is that there's a way of kind of customizing it. Okay? So in terms of the texture mapping, we're going to use primarily, and one of the good things is you guys are here studying architecture. Most of the stuff you're going to create is going to fall into one of the major categories. It's generally going to be a box, or it's generally going to be a cylinder. Right? Those are the most likely things. You have a curved wall, it's a cylinder. You have a square wall, it's a box. Right? That's the most common thing. But let's go ahead and spend a little bit more time with a more complicated object. So I built a little object that is maybe like a handle or something. It's a little bit more complicated. It has a chamfered edge, like on the side. It has two little caps on the end that I assigned a different material to. Okay? And so let me make sure that this has no texture map applied to it. There we go. And under the materials here, I loaded up two materials. I put a metal, so a platinum on the ends. So each of those red pieces is the platinum. And I picked a wood grain that is a kind of an obvious grain so we could see what would happen. Okay? So if I were to just render right now, right, or better yet, let's switch to the rendered mode. Let's go on this side. Okay? The default mapping shows the texture along the top. Then it switches and goes the opposite direction on the chamfer, and then it continues along this way. Okay? So it's not really that good. So let's take this object and let's apply a box map to it. So I'll start with a box map, most closely resembling shape. Right? It's kind of like a box. So we'll do that. We'll say bounding box. We'll say world. And we want it to be capped. OK, so we did that. Let me turn off Gumball here for a second. And give me a second. I'm going to turn off this construction so that we can let's lock this. There. OK, so now, right, the texture comes kind of over. It's generally going in the right direction. That's good. But if I zoom in here, see how there's a seam right along there? Right, I get this weird duplicate pattern. Do you see that? Let's see if I can pick it up somewhere else in this. It's hard because I know exactly what I'm looking for. Yeah, it's there. There's a seam right in there where it repeats. Okay, so it's not bad. Could you get away with this? Sure. Okay, but we could make it a little bit better, a little bit more custom. Okay, so I could once again delete this mapping, and I could apply this. This is, by the way, a joined polygon, so it's all one object. I could say, well, let's do the unwrap. Okay, so I'll click on the unwrap. I'll select my seam. There's only one seam. And now I have my unwrap. I'll use my UV to draw it. There it is. Let me turn off my environment layer so that we can see it. And now I could start to work with my unwrapped surface. So I could, for example, I could rotate it like that. And I could scale it to make it a little bit bigger. Do it like that. And now if I looked at my object, OK, it's not bad. Let me rotate this so that it's going the opposite direction. That. And so now it's wrapping around. That was my seam, so that's the unsuccessful piece. But look at how well it wraps around this edge. See how it's a very smooth wrap as opposed to before it was kind of angular? This is starting to look pretty good, right, with how the texture and the grain actually wraps all the way around, which is part of what the wood would look like. Okay? So I would say this is better, except for this back seam, which is blatantly obvious. So when you pick your seam, it would probably have been better to pick it on the underside than on the top. So you want to be aware that there is going to be a seam, and that seam is going to show. Okay? So it's pretty good, right? That's not a bad strategy for mapping, and we've created it. There is one other option for mapping that's out there. Let me go ahead and apply. Right, there it is. Let me turn it that way. We can see it there for how it wraps around and the lines go through, right, like that. OK, so let's go ahead and delete this once again. And I want to show you the last option. And this is probably the least likely that you're going to use it because it's the most advanced of the strategies. But it's something to be aware of that you can do. Okay? And this would work better if the grain was going the opposite direction. Okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an object. And in this case, I'll create a cylinder. And I want that cylinder to be larger than my object. So there it is, like that. Okay? And let's go ahead and explode it, because I don't need the ends. is just a hollow cylinder. Okay? I'm then going to use this object, and for clarity purposes, I'm going to change this onto the construction layer like that so it doesn't have material assigned. I'm going to use this object as the map for that object. Okay? So I'll take the first object here, and I'll come over here to this rubber ducky, which is called custom mapping. And it's going to say select a surface or mesh to use as your custom mapping object. I'll pick this. Right? And now, if I were to hide this, you can see that that mapping has applied and that this object is now going all the way around it with essentially no seam. Right? It works better in this direction than it does in the other direction because of the nature of the particular mapping. If I wanted this to be a little bit denser, remember I could up this to say 1.5 maybe, and we get a little bit denser pattern. Right? And we'd end up with something like that. So this is the most custom way of creating a texture map, but it is certainly an available option to you should you really need to create something a little bit fancier. Okay? So the purpose today is to experiment and to get through kind of how texture mapping is applied to objects, etc. I'm going to let you go work on texture mapping for about an hour. Then I'm going to come back and I'm going to talk about blocks and kind of assembling pieces together, and we're going to texture map the bridge and the glass piece that we did the last two classes, and then bring them into one final composition. Okay? So we'll come back at, say, 12:45, and I'll talk about that next piece. Okay, so I told you that I'd go through the second part today, giving you some time to work on the texture mapping. A lot of you have already jumped forward and started working on this part, but I want to kind of walk through this. This will be the first time that we walk through kind of the block structure that is in Rhino, but it's something that will become very, very critical towards the end of the semester, so I like to introduce it as a concept early, and then we'll keep reinforcing it as we go forward. Blocks in Rhino are very similar to XREFs in the world of AutoCAD, if you're familiar with those or have used those before. It is a really good way of kind of organizing your files such that you can easily edit certain components and then have it repopulate the number of times that you use it. So I'm going to kind of walk through that. We're going to use two elements today. The first is the little concrete bridge piece that we used before, or that we created a couple exercises ago. And then the second piece will be the little glass wall piece that we used where we created last class. And we're going to put those together into one file. Now, before we can start to assemble them, there's a couple things that need to happen. Number one, any infinite planes that are in the file need to go away, because we don't want the infinite planes being brought with the file. We want to clean up the geometry, and we want to clean up the layers. So in this particular case, I have my object here, but I have a bunch of layers. I'm going to rename layer 1 to be bridge. And it's possible that I would even create a sublayer called concrete, such that I can put all of these on the concrete layer. And then I'm going to get rid of any layers that have anything else on them. So it's as clean as I can possibly get as a file. The other thing that I'll do is I'll make sure that I have a point that is right at 0, 0. So I want this point right there to be at 0, 0, which it already is. Okay, that's a reference point. That's where it's going to come in when we insert it as a block down the road. So I have this bridge, I have the concrete, the layer structure is nice and clean. I've gotten rid of the pieces that I don't want. Right now, I don't have a material assigned to this particular piece yet. So if I went into rendered mode, for example, right, I have no material applied to it just yet. Okay? For right now, I'm going to leave it with no material applied to it. I'm going to come back and apply the material a little bit later on. So now that I have this saved, we'll go ahead and I'm going to do a save as so that I know this is the clean bridge. We'll call this concrete bridge clean, and I'll go ahead and save it. Okay, so now I'm going to open a brand new Rhino file, and so we'll go ahead and open Rhino. And notice that instead of going to File Open or File New, I went and created a brand new Rhino, or at least I tried to open a brand new Rhino. The goal here is to keep the first one open already. And there we go. It's taking a little bit of time to open for whatever reason. OK. So in this brand new Rhino file, this is going to be where I actually create the environment. And so in scripted terms, what we're going to ultimately have is we're going to have a master file. And in the master file, this is where we do all lighting. OK? And we insert all blocks. Come in here. OK? So we have this master file. Right? The blocks are going to be separate files. So in this case, we have bridge. The lighting, this could also be, we could add in right here, environment. And this environment would be the infinite plane for right now. Right? Long term, this environment is going to include things like the sun, etc. Okay, but we're not there yet. The sun, the sky. Right, but like I said, we're not there. Okay? So the blocks are going to be the bridge, and in this case, we're also going to have the glass wall. Okay? Now, inside the bridge file are going to be materials. And inside the glass wall file are going to be materials. But I like to clarify kind of this structure. I know it seems overkill right now. You're like, well, wait a minute, why don't I just copy and paste? But I've got two people in the back who took 136 before. Is this critical at the end or not? Absolutely critical for your sanity. Okay, so take it from two people, not just me who's trying to preach it to you, but take it from them who did the final project. This is mission critical that you start to learn this stuff. Okay, so it's really early. We're only on lecture 7. You know, we're going to get to lecture 29, right? When we get to that point, that starts to really matter. Okay, so this is my master file. So the things that I'm going to create in here would be a layer. We'll call this layer environment. And we'll create a sublayer for environment. Notice we did this already today once. We'll create a sublayer for lighting. And we'll create a sublayer for infinite plane. OK? And for right now, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of all the extra layers. Oops. There we go. So that we're trying to make things as clean as possible. OK? So on the infinite plane layer, we will go ahead and add an infinite plane. There it is. On the lighting layer, and again, I'm double-clicking to make it active, we will add a basic directional light. Long term, we're going to be adding things like suns on the lighting layer, or maybe artificial light if it's a night scene. OK, so let me go ahead and create that basic directional light. We'll go from there to there. We'll get rid of the box. Now that's on the lighting layer. OK? So I was essentially creating the background information. Okay? I'll also go to my VRay options, just like we did earlier today. And I'm going to set my environment with a background color of kind of a gray, so it's not black. Okay? So now that those are set up, and I have my light, it's time to bring in my first block. Okay? This one's going to be that bridge that I already cleaned up. So I'm going to go up to the Edit menu. I'm going to go to Blocks, and then I'm going to go to something called Insert Block Instance. It's also Control-I is the keyboard shortcut for it. Okay? And this brings up this little Insert dialog box. And inside this Insert dialog box, there's a button for Locate Your File. Okay? So we're going to go ahead and find my external file. I know that this is on in today's folder already. So let me go into today's folder. And it's the concrete bridge clean. I'll go ahead and open it. There it is. And we're going to prompt for an insertion point. That's fine. Our scale is going to be uniform. I don't want to rescale the object at all. I'm also not rotating the object at all. I am going to insert this as a block instance. That's the default. We're going to make sure that that's checked. And I'll say OK. Now, I get file insert or insert file options here. Okay, this is absolutely critical, and I want to try to explain this a little bit. Okay, so number one, right here under block definition type, I can choose to, number one, embed, number two, embed and link, and number three, link. Okay, for right now, for what we're doing today, it makes no difference whichever option you choose. However, when you start to get a very complicated file like the ones at the end of the semester, you will increase the speed of which Rhino is working. Imagine a whole house with lots of detail, and you've got light fixtures, and you've got toilets, and you've got sinks, and you've got all this stuff that you've put in, furniture, couches, pillows, right? There's a ton of modeling information. If instead of embedding and linking, we just link the files, right? We no longer have that geometry within this scene. It's just linked. It goes out and gets it when it needs it. It's kind of like InDesign. You guys remember we talked about InDesign. We had the linked files. When we needed it, when we did the export, it went and got that information. It gave us a little preview while we were working. Rhino works the same way. So we're going to choose link as our primary option. You have to be careful, though, that if you choose link and you delete that original file or you move it, you lose it. So you have to keep track of where the original file is. Okay, so just be aware. And we're going to make sure that it's a referenced layer style. So it's link and reference. And we'll go ahead and say OK. Okay? And it's going to then show me the object. There it is. And I can drop it into my scene somewhere. So I'll drop it there for right now. Notice what happens over in the layer stack. Right? See how I now have a layer that's called concrete. Underneath, I've got bridge as a little sublayer. But all of them are grayed out. Okay, if I make this a little bit bigger, we can see it better. Okay, so here it is, concrete bridge-clean.3dm. Inside of that, I have the bridge layer and the concrete layer. I can still turn on and turn off various pieces of that. Okay, so your layer structure matters. You can actually turn things on and turn things off, but they're grayed out because they're a linked referenced set of to this file, which is important. Okay, so now that I have this in the scene, let me go ahead and view it as a shaded mode. Okay, well, I need to move this up a little bit higher, so let's move vertical, and I don't know, let's move it up 10 feet. All right, there it is floating there. Now let me go ahead and I'm going to take this piece and I'm going to copy it. Right, and I'll copy it, I don't know, let's copy it from right here. And let's put a bunch of these together. All right. So I stuck a bunch of those together. Right. If I did a good job, they should show up as horizontal across the top, which they are. Good. Right. I could make my bridge even longer. I could take all of these objects, and then I could copy them, let's say from right there all the way to this end, like that. So that's a pretty fast way of creating a little concrete bridge. Okay? If I were to look at this in rendered mode, right? Well, I don't have any materials applied. Remember, we didn't have those materials applied. I'd like the materials to be applied to this. So let me go ahead, before I move on, I'm going to go ahead and save this file, and we'll call this this is in today's folder. We'll call this master render file, and I'll save. And I'm going to go back to the file where I had the concrete bridge clean open. Okay, so here in the concrete bridge clean, I'm going to remember this is where the materials are applied. So I'll go into my materials. Let's load up some concrete. So I'll load material. Let me go into my flash drive here. Let's go into VRay. Let's go into materials. Let's go into concrete. And I don't know, let's do a horizontal scene concrete. Let's see what that looks like. All right, we'll apply it. So I'm going to apply material to selection. Oops. Sorry, I'm going to apply material to layer. and it's going to go on the concrete layer. And there it is, applied to my bridge. Now, if I go to File and then Save, so I save my file, and then I come back to my master file, which is right here with all of them in it, I'm going to go to the Edit menu, Blocks, and instead of choosing to Insert Block Instance, I'm going to go to this Block Manager. And when I click that, lo and behold, right here, it lists my blocks, the concrete bridge clean, and it says linked file is newer. Right? So it means I made some change in the original file. So at this point, I can go ahead and click on it and then click Update. Okay? And it's going to say one block updated successfully. And now, if I look at it, there, right, is my bridge with the concrete applied. Now, unfortunately, I didn't do a good job of texture mapping the concrete, so let's go back to the original file. There it is. And let's texture map this. So let's take my object here. I'm going to go back to my properties. I'm going to go to my texture mapping. I'll apply a box map to it. We'll do a bounding box, world. Let's cap it. Now I have it applied nicely, which is good. Okay, let's take this and let's increase the scale slightly. Let's do it at maybe 1.5. That's good. Let's go a little bit more than that. Let's go 2.5. I'm deciding what looks right. Okay, so let's say that I like that. I'm happy with it. Right? Now I'll go back and I'll go to File, Save. I'll come back to my original, my master file here. And we'll once again go into Edit, Blocks, Block Manager. Linked file is newer. Let's update that file. Now, once you start messing with materials and you've brought it in once, it's going to ask, wait a minute, you have the same material that's in this file that is in your other file. Do you want to override it or not? And generally speaking, you're always going to replace existing material with the one from your block. Okay? So we'll go ahead and apply to all. Update it successfully. And there it is, matching up with exactly what we did on the previous one. Okay? Is this making sense? Okay, for how these two work. Okay, so let's go back to the glass piece here, and let's clean this one up. So on this, I have a layer for my infinite plane. Let's get rid of that infinite plane. Let's get rid of the light. We don't need that anymore. Let's move this object right to point 0, 0. So we'll go 0, 0, 0. There. Let's create a new layer for glass panel. And let's make the metal and the glass, metal, glass, sublayers of the glass panel. Right? So again, I'm trying to make things nice and clean. Okay? The materials have already been applied in this. I applied them last time. So I'm going to go with it. I'm going to go ahead and go to File, Save As. And this is going to be a glass with spider clamp. And we'll add clean to that as well. And let's make sure it goes into today's folder. And I'll click Save. OK, so now I have this piece. So I'll go back to the master file here. And I'm going to go up to Edit, Blocks, Insert Block Instance. And this time, I don't want the same one. I want the glass. So let me go find, there it is, glass with spider clamp clean. We'll open. Same options. It needs to be a block instance. I'm not adjusting the scale. It's going to be uniform. I'll go ahead and say OK. And once again, link and reference. And I'll say OK. Okay. So if I did it correctly, it should drop in exactly like I want it to. So let's put it maybe right there. And I'm going to switch this for a second into shaded mode to make it a little easier to see. This is going in the wrong direction for right now, so let me go ahead and rotate it. We'll rotate it in that direction. And I want this to become a glass wall. Let's move it a little closer. Let me look at it in the top view here. Move it a little closer to my bridge. maybe like that. And you'll see that once again I have the glass with spider clamp as a reference layer. Here it's grayed out, which is good. But again, I have control such that I could turn off the metal clamps or I could turn off the glass, either one, which is the idea. Notice that when I try to select it, it selects the whole object. That is because it's a block. I can't select the individual pieces. Let's go ahead, and this time I'm going to do a rectangular array. So I'm going to type array. Number in the x direction, what's going to be 1. Number in the y direction, oh, I don't know, let's do 15. Number in the z direction, let's do 5. Y spacing, I want the spacing to go from this point right there to this point right there. My z spacing, I want to go from this point right here to this point right there. Okay? So you can see that it just created a wall for me, okay? Because I just repeat that pattern over and over. I think I need a few more. Let's go with the y number. Where's the y number? Y number, instead of 15, let's do 25. And let's do the z number. Let's do like 10. Okay, it's a big wall. Okay, I'll go ahead and hit enter to finish. And there it is. So I have that wall. Notice that it slows down a bit when I have that much geometry. That's to be expected. There's a way of helping that out that we'll talk about a little bit later on. So let me go ahead and take this first object. I'm going to zoom, select it on that first object. We're going to back up a little bit. And I'm going to create a view that looks out kind of through the window. And from here, I'll go ahead and save my view. So I'll click on the little triangle, go down to Set View, Named Views, and we'll save this as Bridge Perspective. And I'll go ahead and click Save. There it is. And then we'll go ahead and give this a little bit of a render. I am going to go into the options and make sure my output, I get the view aspect so that it matches what I see on the screen. And then we'll go ahead and render this. All right. Once this rendering is done, you'll save it and you'll post it as part of your exercise for today. Okay. Now, one of the important things to remember is with these blocks is that at any point I can go back in time and add detail or change things because it's a block reference. So while this is rendering, I could, for example, go back to my little concrete piece here, and I could say, oh, you know what? It doesn't quite meet code. I need to add a little metal railing at the top. Right? Let me go ahead and add that. So we'll add a little piece here. Let's put something in the center here, diameter of 1.5 inches. Let's do Extrude Curve. We'll go up maybe 4 inches. Let's do another cylinder. Hold on, let me turn on center snap. Oh, come on. And let me do this in side view here. Make that go out that way. Let's scale 1D. Let's make that go over to here. Right? And so I built a little metal rail on top of this. Okay? When I'm done, obviously I didn't assign materials and all the rest of it. We're just going to go ahead and go to File, Save. It saves, and I can come back to my master file. There it is. There's the rendering done. Save it here, etc. Then all I have to do is go back to my Edit, Blocks, Block Manager. There, that concrete bridge is new. We'll update it. Say OK. And now it has the railing that goes all the way along the top. So what happens when you start to reference files is you can create a preliminary version of, say, a window that you're going to use over and over again, or in this case, the bridge. And then you can keep adding detail as you go forward. Oh, I don't really like that, or I want to add a little bit more here, or I want to add a little bit more there. And as long as you're updating the blocks, it'll update in your final scene with all the right render settings, etc. Okay? So for the end today, you just need to put these pieces together, give me a little render, and we'll call it a day. Are there any questions? Yeah. Okay, I'll come help you. I know that this is, the early stages of blocks, but I want to keep reinforcing it. It'll become much more obvious as we go forward in the class.